Hi, I'm Yara and this is Mark, and today we're going to present our final design for Cape Town. So we're just going to introduce it, talk about our vision, and then go through each sector, kind of. So just a brief introduction. Cape Town is located in South Africa on the northern cape of the peninsula. Has a mild climate. It's the most visited city in Africa because it also acts as a hub for IT and manufacturing companies. Has a population of 3.7 million people. Brief history or background. It has an interesting history to say the least because of apartheid. It's been like 20 odd years since democracy, and they're still left with a fragmented, divided, inconvenient for the poor kind of city because of apartheid. A lot of the policies that went through during apartheid to kind of create that design for the city. You're very similar to Johannesburg, where like the poor people are on the outskirts and there's a big racial divide, obviously. So this leads the poor people to be isolated from the economic opportunities, increasing their travel time, and obviously they have very poor transit systems. And one thing we talked about is foreign class. Right now Cape Town is going through a drought, so that's another issue that we're going to be talking about. For our vision, so we're not unaware that Cape Town is a developing city and there are a lot of hurdles for that, so we try to keep our design as realistic as possible with the research that we were able to find. So you'll be based in neighborhood level spaces for food markets, because those are things to preserve the culture of Cape Town. Education is a really big thing because in almost everything the general hurdles where the people were unaware of the costs or uneducated about sustainable solutions, and there's a common misconception that they usually are more expensive. And obviously the main goal at the end is to reduce the GHG emissions. Mark will talk about the environmental.
So to talk about the Cape Town's environmental sustainability right now. So Siemens did a study to compare all African cities, 15 different African cities, and Cape Town was found to be the greenest African city. So the study was based on policies and quantifiable metrics. So in general, Cape Town scores pretty well in all the sectors except energy and waste, where it has a lot of policies, but in terms of quantifiable metrics, it doesn't do well. So for the energy sector, it's mostly because of their electricity generation mix. So we talked about in class that Cape Town, 90% of Cape Town's electricity generation is based on coal. So if you look at the electricity consumption emissions, they generate 4,099 kilograms per capita, which is 4 times the African average. And then in terms of waste, most of their waste just goes to landfills and they don't recycle anything. So in terms of management policies that are going to affect their 2050 vision, so in 2003, Cape Town was the first African city to implement an integrated metropolitan environmental policy, which basically sets up strategies in different environmental sectors to make a change. In 2010, they also adopted an energy and climate change action plan, which mainly has 11 objectives, such as, for example, having at least 10% renewable energy in their electricity mix by 2020. And to reach these objectives, they've been setting up different projects. So by now, they already have 130 different projects that are underway to address these objectives. And on top of that, they have an air quality management plan that is mostly monitoring and trying to improve urban air pollution, specifically in low-income areas. So to talk about buildings, so Cape Town has a residential area of 750,000 meters squared. And out of these 750,000 meters squared, 80% are detached houses. So they don't have a lot of apartments. So going from there, we designed our building strategy based on low-income homes and mid-rise buildings. So because 40% of the population is low-income, we decided to go for retrofits for these low-income homes, as they could be probably subsidized by the government. So I'm not going to go into details about the components because a lot of groups touched on them, but in the end it's just sustainable components that could be easily subsidized by the government. So in terms of buildings, Cape Town's population is going to increase, and already having so much detached houses, they're going to have to densify at some point and start building buildings. So we focused on a mid-rise green building design, which mostly include passive solar design, grey water recycling system, and etc. So for transportation.
Okay. Our next sector is transportation. And just as you mentioned before, because of the way the city was planned in the past many years, this led to dispersed development patterns, inequitable access in low densities, which is really bad for transportation, and an outdated rail system, which is one of their biggest problems. So right now they have rail, bus, BRT, and unscheduled minibus taxis, which if you're not haven't lived in a developed country, it's basically like these buses or vans that aren't run by the government, and they're usually very, very crowded and much cheaper, and especially in developing countries, people use that because of cost. And one of the main problems is obviously that the rail is really, really old, and the safety is a really big issue. That's one of the main issues of people not wanting to use transportation as well, and also because of the really long travel times from getting up from the out of the city to the inner part of the city. So obviously we would go for transit-oriented growth and development, basically to increase the capacity along the corridors to create more accessible zones for people, because right now the way things are, it's very racially divided, and the people are left with inaccessible and unusable zones. So this is done by increasing the rail network capacity. There were 2 or 3 corridors that were identified as problematic. One of them will have 2 or 3 extra stations for rail. The other problem corridors will be served by BRT, using a system of trunk and feeder routes that will be linked to both networks. So to kind of ensure an integratable, interoperable, intermodal system, which is always the goal, we use the BRT to serve the problem corridors instead of the minibus taxis, because it's harder to integrate that with the rail, to integrate that in terms of scheduling and timing. They want to move towards a more developed transportation system, or we want to move towards a more developed transportation system. More and more the transport, right now only 1% are by bicycle. Biggest deterrent is again safety and security. So for that, we suggest a communication plan that informs people about road user, proper road behavior, as well as to increase incident reporting, and also to providing cycling infrastructure other than retrofits and stuff like that. We also suggest a cheap bike production facility, because again 40% of the population is low income, so biking is cheap and carbon friendly and a good way to get around. Mike will explain that more.
As you can see in these 2 pictures, so the residential and employment densities are on opposite sides of the city. This is Cape Town, just for reference, in the corner, this, the center of Cape Town. So going from there, our land use strategy is based on transit-oriented development. So kind of similar to what they were doing in Johannesburg. We're going from the radial transit corridors and trying to develop these corridors along the way. But also what we're also trying to do is to set up a multi-center city with sub-cities that are kind of relatively self-contained. So this is mostly important. So first of all, it would reduce the distances for trips, and then it would also encourage, by doing this, it would encourage active transportation. But most importantly, it would help the low-income populations to actually for social inclusion. So because people that live here would never find a job in the city, because public transit represents 25% of their monthly income. So this would, creating multi-cities would kind of help them create their own work and a living area. So in terms of neighborhoods, this is kind of an example of how the transit corridors would be developed. So if we have a station here, we would have different grades of densification with higher densification in the closer proximity and affordable subsidized mixed housing a bit further away. So now looking at energy, this graph represents Cape Town's current energy consumption and how it's projected to evolve in a business as usual scenario. So right now Cape Town's at around 120 million megajoules, and it's expected to quadruple by 2050 to around 440. So the main sectors are residential, commercial, industrial, and transport. So we addressed transport earlier. But then to look at the other sectors, we found that a lot of the energy consumption in these sectors are linked to electricity production. So we focused our energy design on their electricity production mix to have an effect on as many sectors as possible. So Cape Town right now is, as I said before, most of their energy is generated from coal. 90% is generated from coal. And all the coal plants are mostly here, and Cape Town's here. So they also experience a lot of transmission losses. And on top of that, right now they've been trying to set up renewable energy. So they started with 2 wind farms next to Cape Town. And so Cape Town, we found a lot of studies that showed that there's a lot of potential for carbon storage in the area. So what we're proposing from this is to set up new coal plants that are focused on carbon storage. And this way our new electricity generation mix would reduce coal from 90% to 48% while increasing other renewables. And this would reduce the emission factor linked to electricity generation by 60%. So now for water.
Yeah. So as you mentioned before, Cape Town and South Africa, Cape Town mainly is going through like an intense drought because of the insufficient rainfall and dam levels. So right now, so in the past 2 years, I think the water service authorities implemented their water restrictions. The main general barriers, again, are like people being uninformed about sustainable technologies and ways to reduce demand. So basically they rely mostly on surface water. The formal households will be supplied with an integrated system of dams, pump stations, and pipelines, which is already like exists right now, like typical municipal system. But they have a really big issue again with really old infrastructure, so pipe replacement program in place, and it should be intensified to reduce like sewage blockages and water losses. And for the informal dwellings, it's suggested like meter water standpipe, which is basically like a tank and a connection to the sewer. It's going to be like a concrete structure that has a sink, that has like a sink and on the outside and a meter to supply water to the households. And also things like cellular meters, which have big place in African markets because they don't need like your traditional infrastructure to give people like metering opportunities. For waste management, just for time, for waste management, basically like widening collection zones because transportation has a lot of emissions from collecting and delivering garbage. A waste incineration facility that has, following an example from Japan, very low emissions but very high power capacity. For home appliance recycling, typically in developed countries, they take appliance recycling and use that, but it's very dangerous for people, so it's suggested to sort through them. And as things at the source, there are things like equalizer and the green dot scheme, which basically charges corporations for the use of plastic.
So to look at our total GHG emissions by sector between 2017 and 2050, so we can see that the main focus of our project, which was transport and residential, both increased slightly, which was expected because we have a population increase. But all the other sectors, emissions reduced, offering an overall reduction in total emissions from 25 to 24. So this was due mainly because we mostly addressed the electricity generation sector, which kind of impacts all the different sectors. So looking at the same thing, but the GHG emissions but per capita, all the GHG emissions per capita for every single sector decreased, except for transport, which is interesting because when we designed our transport strategy, we tried to move people from the informal minibus system, which are small and low emitting, to the formal DRT feeder buses. So the feeder buses are bigger, so this led to an increase in emissions.
Yeah, and just finally, we just presented a couple of the sustainable development goals. One of our main focus is transportation, so provide safe, affordable, accessible systems for all. Yeah, so the transport design aims to provide 80%, and safety is the communication plan. By 2030, enhance inclusive and sustainable urbanization. Again, this ties into our land use. Reduce apartheid division, a multi-city center like Mike said, and safer and more socially integrated communities. In conclusion, we tried to make this design as realistic as possible. It was a lot of fun researching and getting to know Cape Town. And yeah, we hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.